Welcome Home, a podcast for veterans, about veterans by veterans, is a project of Willing Warriors and the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run.
Good morning. I'm Larry Ziliox, Director of Culinary Services here at the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run. And today our guest is Becky Ellis. She's a writer, and she's got a fabulous book out called Little Avalanches, and it's a memoir of her life growing up with her father, who was a World War II veteran who suffered from PTS, and the impact it had on her, for the family, and what it was like growing up in that kind of environment. It's a fascinating book, and we'll get into the book in a minute. But Becky, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Larry. I appreciate what you're doing here on the podcast, all the resources you offer to veterans and their families, and what you do at Bull Run. I know it's very meaningful work, so thank you.
Yeah, so when did you decide to write this book?
It evolved pretty quickly because my father never talked about his combat experience, and not when I was a kid, not when I was an adult. It's something, like a lot of veterans, he wouldn't talk about. And then when he was 89, he came to my home and asked if we had any issues to clear up. And while we had a lot of issues, I wanted to hear about the war because I knew he carried something really heavy from the war. And I know that's where a lot of kind of the shadowy part of life and the tough stuff that we all kind of endured came from. So I asked him about the war in 2014 when he was 89. And he was really resistant in talking about it, but he eventually opened up. And as soon as he started telling me about it, and as soon as I started putting together the pieces of his experience and mine, I thought, I've got to tell this story. So it was shortly after he started really opening up about his experience.
So if you don't mind, think about that time and then go back 3 years and tell us about Becky Ellis 3 years prior. What was she doing? What was she up to?
Yeah, so 3 years prior, I had this carefully curated life that was so different than my childhood. You know, it was one of those lives. I have 3 kids. I was raising them, I thought, really differently than I had been raised, in a really supportive home with great vacations and nice automobiles and granite countertops. And it was carefully curated. And my father would visit me. And every time he would visit, I felt like I was holding this life together with Scotch tape. Like I was hiding. I thought I had escaped my childhood. And I realized after my dad started talking, I realized I was hiding from it. But that's kind of the life I had. I had a great job, a successful career. Everything seemed to be going along well. And so when my father asked if we had any issues, I think he expected me to say, look around, Dad, everything's great. But that's not what I said. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about growing up in a household where PTS was prominent, but it wasn't PTS then. It really wasn't something that returning soldiers were treated for. It wasn't even called PTS back then. It was shell shock and a number of different terms. But also, too, in reading the book and reading about your growing up with your father, it doesn't seem like he was the kind of guy that even if it had been pointed out to him that he had PTS, that he would have gotten treatment.
Right. I think my dad tried to get treatment. I think he knew he was carrying something really heavy. He drank a lot. He was an alcoholic. And when I turned 12, he stopped drinking. And things lightened up a little bit after that. But he was still living with, the battlefield every day. And he isolated us in many ways, unintentionally. And we suffered kind of under his command, but he suffered too. And he's the kind of father that I feared and I revered also. I felt protected by him, but not protected from him, if that makes sense. I kind of felt protected by him. I knew that, no one else in the world would hurt us, but that didn't protect us from him. And for example, he wanted us to be really tough as old nails, his kids. And he wanted us to be prepared. Prepared for what? We had no idea. But he did things like he had us get our teeth drilled without Novocaine, stuff like that he wanted us to be tough. He wanted us to be able to endure pain. He wanted us to have mind over matter. And I think it was a survival mechanism for him. And he wanted to know that we could survive too. And it didn't make sense because at that time, this was the early 70s and other kids were, roller skating and dancing and listening to disco. And I was learning to shoot a gun and getting my teeth drilled without Novocaine and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It was a different life.
Yeah. And it's obvious from reading that there was no quit allowed. I'm thinking of your time learning to water ski. It's just you got out there and you were out there until you were able to do it.
Yeah, in my father's mind and in his experience, if you quit, you were dead.
Yeah.
And he made it clear to us that if you quit, you're dead. That's what he would say. No explanation, no reasoning. My dad would not offer that.
So he obviously self-medicated. It took a toll on the family. Your parents were divorced. Would you consider yourself a latchkey kid growing up?
Definitely. I was definitely a latchkey kid, my brother and I. Yeah. We lived with my mom. She was our primary parent, but every other weekend we visited my father and we spent half the summers with him and, the whole custody agreement stuff. And my mom worked really hard to, financially support us. So she worked all the time. And we were kind of on our own.
And
my brother and I.
I think it's worth pointing out, too, that sometimes the picture of veterans who suffer PTS and the invisible wounds of combat is they deteriorate, especially when they self-medicate. But your dad was a functioning alcoholic and he was a successful physician.
Yes, he was. And he was really well respected in his community and our community. And he hid. Most people don't know what goes on. No matter what kind of family, people don't know what goes on behind closed doors, right? And so no one really knew he was an alcoholic. And he eventually told me he drank so he could sleep. If he did not drink, he had relentless nightmares and he had to drink himself to sleep into, state of stupor before he could even fall asleep. He was afraid to sleep because of the nightmares. And my dad, he was a rifleman on the front lines through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. And he had spent 172 consecutive days in combat. And he was a night fighter. And he didn't sleep in a bed or brush his teeth or do any of those things for 6 months. He essentially lived outside in the mud in the freezing cold winter during that time. And the mortality rate of his unit was 300%, the casualty rate. And so he saw a lot of trauma in combat. And yeah, he wanted us to be as tough as he was so we could endure anything, basically.
Yeah.
And it was out of love. I know now, I didn't understand as a child, but I know now that it was out of love because at one point my dad said to me, when he came home, he continued to put himself in high-risk, dangerous situations to prove to himself over and over that he would survive. And he continued to do that to his family and the people that he loved to prove to himself that we could survive. And that was, I think, kind of the crux of what was going on in my childhood.
Yeah.
But during the day, he was perfectly high functioning.
Right. And you recognized, though, as a child that this wasn't normal, right?
Yes. At some point, I realized it wasn't normal. As a very young child, I didn't know what was normal. Young children don't really know. But when you get into, elementary years, you start hearing about what your friends did on the weekend.
Yeah.
And it was very different than my experience. the birthday parties they had versus when my birthday was celebrated was completely different.
Wow. So take us forward now. You leave home, go to college, and then that starts a different phase of your life. And how is your dad involved in that?
I continued to visit my dad, but I had kind of this guarded and distant relationship with him. And I think, like all children, I really wanted my dad to love me and I wanted to have a close relationship with him. But he was really hard to love sometimes. And I did keep in touch with him constantly, though.
Mhm.
It was this need I had to, I don't know if it was a need to heal him or to see him be healed, because I felt this wound that he carried very deeply. But I went off to college and then I started my life. I got married, I had children, I started into my career, and I got really wrapped up in all of that and kind of ignored or didn't have time to deal with that trauma from my own childhood. But it ultimately catches up with you, and it caught up with me.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it just intentions. And I think that we have a lot of really good intentions. And I've had tons of therapy myself to sort it all out,
Mm-hmm.
to get to the place that I've come to. And it was during that time of raising children when my father turned 89. He had me later in life and he turned 89 and he came to talk to me. And the conversation we had was a huge part of my healing process.
And the trauma is generational, obviously. Did it affect your relationship with your own children?
I think so. I like to think that I parented really different than my father, and in some ways I did, but in some ways I parented similarly to him. My father was really capable, really competent, really strident. I am all those things and can be all those things too.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also warm and loving. I have 3 daughters, 2 of them, but I had pretty strict rules. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I see places where I passed that trauma along, and I'm working on healing that now as well. It's the awareness that I think was so important to me that I didn't have until I could understand where the trauma really came from,
Yeah.
that I could really start digging deep and excavating and figuring out where it came from. And it was through this year-long, it was actually multi-years with my father. Once he started talking to me about the war, it was at my kitchen table over a tuna sandwich that I asked him about the war. And he was super resistant. And no, he wasn't going to talk about it. The only thing I needed to know was that his feet were frozen for 172 days.
Mm.
And my father raised me in his likeness. And you asked if I was similar to him. I can be as relentless as he can be. And I'm not proud of that, but I see that in myself. And we sat at the kitchen table and back and forth we went. He didn't want to talk about it. Well, I wanted to hear about it. He didn't want to talk about it. And I needed to hear about it, until he finally opened up. And when he did, he talked to me about it he lived another 7 years, and he talked to me about it every single time we spoke. There was something else he needed to tell me, one other thing he thought was really important to share. And it was such a gift. It was such a gift to understand his experience, or to hear about it.
Right.
And understand it as best I could.
For you, what impact do you think it had on him?
Partway through our conversation, about a year into it, he came to visit me, and my father wouldn't talk about being a veteran. He didn't wear a t-shirt or a hat or a pin. He had a little United States flag pin that he used to wear on his lapel when he wore a suit, but that was it. Other than that, he wouldn't talk about it. And now and then he wore a t-shirt with a wolf on it. He loved t-shirts with wolves, and that symbolized the Timberwolves to him. But it wasn't the Timberwolf patch with his infantry division. It wasn't any of that. It was just a lone wolf on a t-shirt. And his password used to be the lone wolf on things. And that was as far as he would go in terms of expressing any of his military service. And halfway through, a year into our conversation, he showed up wearing a World War II veteran's hat at the airport when I picked him up. And this is something I write about in the book Little Avalanches.
Mm.
And I was just shocked. I thought, my God, what has happened to my father?
Mm.
And what is he doing? I thought he had lost his mind. That was so different than anything I'd ever experienced in him before. And so I think it had this shift in him where he started to accept and express his service in a different way.
Mm.
And he started to open up to other people about it too, and started to talk about it. Not all the time. Like, you had to really be close, and you had to really be patient and really want to know about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I also know that that's the positive part. I also know that it took a toll on him, because he would leave my house after our conversation absolutely exhausted. And I know his nightmares got heavier after a conversation. I know it was really hard for him to talk about. So I want to acknowledge that too, that I know it's really hard.
When decided to do the book, what did he think about that?
At first he didn't want his name shared. He didn't want any information that it could relate back to him. But after I got into it, and after he read a draft of it, he said, you really need to share this book. This is really important, because he thought that, he felt like people outside the military don't really understand what military service is about or is like. And he really saw the value in sharing his story. And the book is not just my story. It's my story and his story and our story, which is super unconventional for memoir. I didn't want to only tell my story, because I think my story is inconceivable without understanding his experience. And I think his experience is incomplete without understanding his family's experience. There are so many books I've read, so many movies I've seen, so many stories I've heard about veterans' war experience, and they all kind of end on the battlefield. And that is not when the veteran's life ends. And I think that some people have the impression that military service is a couple of years. And it is a lifetime of service, because I know that military experience stays with people for their whole lifetime. And I think they're trading, a normal civilian life for a life that they could not even have imagined. I don't think people really know what is coming when they decide and they choose a life of military service.
I think what's really important, and I'm so glad that you told the story the way you did, because if you just had included your life, I think he would have just been viewed as a villain. And it's so important to understand what brought him to the point where it impacted you all. I just think the family is always such an integral part of this story, and the impact that the service, especially combat-related service, has on the family is one that's not told very often. And that's really what the value in your book is. It's just phenomenal to put it all together in such a way that it makes sense. Because for so many people out there, it just doesn't make sense. Even the people that are involved in the family, they're looking at it not understanding why dad or their husband or their brother or sister or wife is just acting the way they are and not getting the help that they need. And so it's just great. It's a great, great story.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was really important to me to kind of tell the story in the way I experienced it, from the child's point of view, and to let readers experience my childhood with me from not knowing. And I think by the end of part one, which is my childhood, my dad's really not a very likable character. But 3 pages into part two, which is his combat experience, and I think people are flooded with empathy and understanding. And that was really important to me. I wanted to share his experience because, like I said before, it was such a gift that he shared it with me. And I've talked to many veterans since the book came out in March, and I know a lot of, especially combat veterans, hold a belief that the world cannot understand what they've been through. And I think they're right. I think we can't really understand, but we can try, and we can try to talk about, the experience we have, and we can hear their experience, just even with the 1% chance that someone will understand. And that's what I'm doing, is I'm trying to connect with others, because I've lived through the consequences of combat pain, and I've lived in the shadow of that pain. My dad experienced that pain directly, and it may be impossible to understand his experience or the veteran's experience without actually living it and feeling that torture and pain. But in the way that good books can create empathy and transport people to, you know, other other worlds and other times,
Mm-hmm.
I think through sharing veteran stories, someone out there might kind of get it. And I think we really need to do a better job of understanding our veterans. I met with my father was a member of the 104th Infantry, the Timberwolves, and they are still a reserve infantry unit that operates out of Washington. And I had the privilege of talking with the retired general of the current 104th.
Mm.
And he said to me, Becky, we're good at fighting war, but we are not good at recovering from it. And we need to do better. And this is my effort to try to help in some way do better through kind of encouraging conversation, so that our veterans feel less isolated, less alone, less disconnected, and their families too. I mean, it's so heartbreaking to see families that want so desperately to connect, and they just can't. But I think through conversation and sharing our stories, I think we really can, even if it's a 1% chance that we can connect. I think it's so worth it. It made such a huge difference in my life and my father's life, that I feel the importance of it, the importance of the maybe, just maybe, just if there's a chance.
Well, I think it's a much higher percentage than 1%. I think if
I hope so.
the more people who can read this book, the higher that percentage is going to go, because this is a gift to families and to veterans, to help them understand generational trauma, to understand what the warrior goes through, then comes back and is without their tribe, and then has to assimilate back into a society in such a way that they appear normal and deal with the issues of the nightmares and reliving their combat experience, and trying to hold down a job, trying to keep a marriage together, trying to parent kids. And it's hard. And when it starts to come apart at the seams, this book will help people understand why, help people understand that they need to get help. You can't do this on your own. The family needs to get help. The veteran needs to get help. It's so important to try and address and do everything you can to address generational trauma, because there's no reason today, especially, that this has to go on in a ripple effect and affect family after family after family. I think it's also important to point out that you experienced this with a World War II veteran. So I don't want families and listeners to think, well, my dad was in Vietnam, or my dad was in Iraq. Well, it's still for you, because that experience that the veteran has, whether it's World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the combat experience is nearly identical. The only difference is the equipment and the time. And so
Right.
the effects
And the weather.
right. Yeah. And the effects of their service is nearly identical, regardless of the conflict. So this book is for everybody. It's not just for somebody whose dad was 89 and fought in World War II. It is for all veterans, and I would encourage everybody to pick up a copy. There will be a link to the book so you can purchase it right from Amazon. I'll put that link in the show notes, and I really, really encourage everybody to pick up a copy because it's an easy read too, folks. It's not like a physics text. It's a very easy read. It's a great story. It reminds me of the great Santini.
That's a huge compliment.
Yeah. Actually, the star of that movie happens to be one of our neighbors out here near the retreat. Robert Duvall.
That's amazing. Something I wanted to say about that is that, it has been a very useful tool for a few Vietnam veterans that I know. And one of them in particular said to me, my daughters want to know about my experience and I can't talk to them about it. And I gave them this book as a conversation starter because everything your dad tells you about how he felt, I felt that way, the loneliness. In part three of the book is this conversation my father and I have toward the end of his life. And he goes into everything you just said about the loneliness and the difficulty in assimilating and all of the trouble he had when he came back. And you're right, it is the same. Every veteran's experience, I think, is different, but there are such common threads within that unique and individual experience. And those are the things that, I wrote about in a universal way so that they could be a mirror for other veterans and other veteran families. And I also think that it's a great tool for civilians who might not understand veterans and veterans who want civilians to understand their experience. Maybe it's a, friend or a distant family member who just can't understand it. I think it's good for that too, to say, here's something that might give you a pinhole look into my experience. And in that pinhole, light will come through. A lot of people who have read it have been civilians, and they have said, I've read a ton of books on war, and this was really different because my father's experience is journal format through combat, and it really gets into what the day-to-day relentless combat is like, and what that experience is like. And I think that my dad used to say they had their propaganda, we have ours. And not books like The Great Santini, and there are some books that are unique and they don't glorify war, but I think a lot do. Mm-hmm. And I think that is hard. That is hard for veteran families because the movies I saw and the books I read, they weren't my experience, and they weren't the experience of anybody that I knew.
Yeah. Not real world, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming on today. Our guest has been Becky Ellis. She's the author of this amazing book, Little Avalanches. Again, I'm going to put the link in the show notes so you can just go right to Amazon and have it in a day or so. I would encourage everybody to get a copy, share it. It's going to make a great Christmas present for a few people I know. But Becky, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much, Larry. I appreciate your time as well.
We'll have another episode next Monday morning at 0500 for those of you who'd like to get up early and listen to podcasts. Until then, thanks for listening.
The Welcome Home podcast is brought to you by Willing Warriors, a nonprofit organization serving active duty service members and veterans since 2012. To learn more, please visit our webpage at willingwarriors.org.